She was a queen, a real one, not by title, not by ceremony, but by the kind of steel that gets forged in silence, in humiliation, in years of standing straight while the world does its worst to break your spine. And on the night her husband handed her an umbrella and told her to hold it over his pregnant mistress, in front of thousands, most people assumed that was the end of her. They were wrong. Stay with me to the very last second, like this video. And drop your city in the comments right now. I want to know exactly where you're watching from when everything changes for Queen Seraphine Ashcroft. Yet, the rain came sideways that evening. It didn't drift down the way autumn rain usually did over the Ashcroft capital, that fine gray mist that softened the edges of the stone towers and made the royal banners hang heavy and dark. No, this rain had teeth. It came off the northern range in sheets driven by a wind that smelled like iron and wet earth, the kind of storm that flattened crops and flooded the lower market roads and sent servants scrambling for the shutters before the candles even had a chance to gutter. Seraphine felt it first on the back of her neck. She was standing at the tall, arched window of the Queen's anteroom, already dressed for the Harvest Festival procession. Her gown dark burgundy, her hair pinned back with the 3 iron combs that had belonged to her mother, her hands clasped in front of her the way her governess had taught her 40 years ago in a different house, a different life. The window glass rattled in its iron frame. She pressed 2 fingers against it and felt the cold move through her skin like a warning. Mira, her senior handmaid, appeared in the doorway behind her. 50 years old, built like a woman who'd survived genuine hardship rather than courtly inconvenience, with gray starting to thread through her dark hair and a face that knew better than to announce bad news too loudly. "The council steward came by," Mira said. She kept her voice flat, which was itself a kind of communication. "His Majesty has altered the procession arrangement." Seraphine did not turn from the window. "How?" "You'll walk directly behind, not beside." Outside, the first lightning moved across the sky, distant and wordless. Seraphine watched the branches of the old courtyard oak bend hard to the left and stay there, straining. "And Lady Morel?" she said. A pause. Not a long one. Mira had learned years ago that hesitation cost more than the truth. "She walks beside the king. His Majesty has also requested," another breath, "that you carry the ceremonial umbrella, the ivory-handled one from the East Wing stores." The courtyard oak branches stayed bent. The wind didn't let up. Seraphine turned from the window then, and Mira watched her face move through something. Not surprise. Not quite. More like a person who has spent a long time calculating the weight a bridge can hold, and who now watches the first crack appear exactly where they expected it. Her jaw set. Her chin came up a fraction of an inch. "Which color canopy?" she said. "Gold and white, Your Majesty? The ceremonial—" "Fetch it." Mira didn't move immediately. Her eyes stayed on Seraphine's face, asking a question without asking it. Seraphine looked at her directly and said nothing else, and that nothing carried enough weight that Mira turned and went to fetch the umbrella. Seraphine walked to the mirror on the east wall. The woman looking back at her was 38 years old, with the kind of face that had been called beautiful in youth, and was now called something more complicated. Striking, perhaps, or severe. High cheekbones. Eyes that were a particular shade of brown that sometimes looked almost amber when the light caught them sideways. A mouth pressed into a line that had learned not to tremble. There was a fine scar along her left jaw, almost invisible under the powder, earned during a riding accident 9 years ago when Cedric had not visited the infirmary even once. She looked at herself for a long time. Then she straightened the iron combs, smoothed the front of her gown, and walked out to meet the rain. The Festival of Harvest had been held in the Ashcroft capital every year for 300 years without interruption. Even during the border wars of King Edric IV's reign, even during the plague year when they'd lost a third of the lower city and the streets smelled of pine resin and burning. The procession had gone forward. It was one of those traditions that had stopped being purely ceremonial long ago and had become structural, a thing that held the shape of the kingdom together the way mortar held stone. Thousands lined the processional route. The nobility took the covered viewing platforms along the central avenue. The high lords and their wives wrapped in furs, the provincial governors with their retinues, the merchant council in their formal coats. Below them, pressed 6 deep against the roped barriers, the common people of the capital stood in the rain without ceremony, because that was their place and always had been. And they watched the proceedings the way people always watch things that are partly spectacle and partly warning. Seraphine walked out of the eastern palace gate at the appointed hour and was handed the umbrella by a pale-faced young page who would not look her in the eye. She took it without comment. The ivory handle was cold and smooth in her palm. The canopy above it was cream silk trimmed with gold thread. Beautiful work, the kind of thing that had cost someone a significant sum, and that in this context was an instrument of public humiliation with a price tag. 20 yards ahead, King Cedric Vallon walked into view. He was 44, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that money and authority produce in men who've never had either tested hard enough to break them. He wore deep blue tonight, a new coat with gold buttons, and his dark hair was trimmed close. He was smiling, not the formal, controlled smile he wore at council sessions or treaty signings. A real one, relaxed and privately satisfied, the smile of a man who had decided he didn't care anymore what anything looked like, because he was the king and the king's desires were their own justification. Beside him, on his left arm, walked Lady Mirelle Conrath. She was 26. She had the kind of beauty that photographed well in the cold light, pale skin, dark eyes, the particular grace of a woman who had been raised to understand that her appearance was a resource and who had managed it accordingly. Her gown was midnight blue, a color that under other circumstances would have been considered bold for someone of her station at a royal festival. Her pregnancy was visible now. She was perhaps 5 months along, and she wore it the way she wore everything, with deliberate display. Her hand rested on Cedric's arm with the ease of a woman who had practiced arriving. She had arrived, completely, publicly, in front of 3,000 witnesses. The crowd was very quiet for a moment that stretched out longer than was comfortable, and then the formal heralds called the procession forward, and the noise of the festival swept back in, drums and brass and the low roar of voices. And Seraphine walked. She held the umbrella over Lady Mirelle's head with both hands and walked 2 steps behind, in the rain, in her burgundy gown, with her mother's iron combs in her hair, and said absolutely nothing. Puss, she could feel it. Not the rain, though that was relentless now, the kind of sustained downpour that soaked through the outer fabric of her gown within the first 100 steps, and found its way down the back of her neck and into her shoes. Not even the cold, though her fingers had gone stiff around the ivory handle by the time they were a third of the way down the processional route. What she could feel was the watching. It moved over her like a second cold, the weight of 3,000 pairs of eyes recalibrating, reassessing, reaching for a verdict. She had been watched all her life, from the moment her father had offered her as a bride to consolidate a border alliance, and she'd stood in the Ashcroft receiving hall at 18 with her chin up and her heart going hard and careful behind her ribs. Being watched was not new. Being watched like this was different. From the platform nearest the palace steps, she caught a glimpse of Lord Harwick Rain, the king's senior military advisor, 60 years old, built like a wall with opinions, watching the procession with his thick arms crossed, and an expression she recognized as distaste being carefully managed into neutrality. Beside him, Governor Aldrich Foss of the southern provinces was saying something quietly to his wife, who turned her face away from the spectacle with the controlled movement of a woman who understood that her face was being watched and was choosing not to let it say the wrong thing in public. Lower on the platform, the young Lord Theron Cress caught her eye. He was new to the capital circuit, 27. His father's elevation to the minor nobility still fresh enough that he hadn't learned yet to fully school his expressions. He was looking at Seraphine with something naked and uncomfortable on his face, something that might have been outrage if he'd had the standing to afford it, and he looked away quickly when their eyes met. Lady Mirelle said something to Cedric, something low and bright, and Cedric laughed. The sound of it carried over the rain and the drums with the easy clarity of a man who had stopped worrying about what his laughter announced. Seraphine's hands did not tighten on the umbrella handle. She kept her grip exactly as it was. She kept her pace exactly as it was. She walked in the rain and held a silk canopy over another woman's head while her husband's laugh moved through the wet air around her, and the kingdom watched, and she let them watch. and she thought about the document she'd reviewed 3 nights ago in the cipher room behind the library, the figures that didn't balance, the seal she'd recognized on a secondary trade charter that should never have carried it, the name that appeared twice in payment records where it had no business appearing once. She thought about patience, the specific kind, not the passive kind that people confuse with weakness, but the working kind, the kind that has a task attached to it, the kind a person learns when they've understood that the right moment costs nothing but time, and that most people can't afford to wait for it because most people haven't understood that yet. She walked in the rain. She held the umbrella straight and level. In the great hall afterwards, still damp, her gown exchanged for something dry by the time the formal supper was arranged, Seraphine sat in her place at the far end of the high table and watched the celebration proceed without her. Cedric toasted Morel. He raised his glass and spoke about new life and the future of the Ashcroft line, and there were people at that table who lifted their glasses because they wanted to, and people who lifted their glasses because they'd calculated the consequences of not doing so, and Seraphine could tell the difference. She had always been able to tell the difference. It was a skill she'd developed early in this marriage, the way certain people in hostile climates develop an instinct for identifying what kind of storm is coming before the sky changes color. She lifted her own glass when the time came, not immediately, a half-second after the others, carefully calibrated. She touched it to her lips. She did not drink. Across the table, Lord Harwick Rain was watching her. When she set the glass down and glanced in his direction, he looked away first. That was interesting. Harwick Rain did not, as a rule, look away from things. Seraphine filed it where she filed everything, behind her face, in the part of her mind that had been cataloging this kingdom and its people for 20 years. The supper went on. Morel accepted compliments with the gracious warmth of someone who had rehearsed being magnanimous. She touched her stomach twice, both times at moments calculated to draw eyes. She said the right things to the right people, and Seraphine watched her do it and recognized the competence in it. Morel was not stupid, had never been stupid, and her campaign against the crown had always been mistaken for a personal affair by the people who preferred simple narratives. It wasn't personal, it was institutional. Morel's family, the Conraths of the Eastern Shore, had been maneuvering toward royal proximity for 2 generations, and Morel herself was the culmination of a long, patient effort that deserved a kind of bitter respect for its architecture, even if the architecture was rotten at every joint. The Eastern Shore trade licenses, the secondary charter, the name in the payment records, Conrath, spelled in the 3rd variant, the diminutive form that would allow deniability, except that Seraphine had 3 separate documents that established the variant as a deliberate evasion rather than a coincidence, because there was no clean explanation for why that variant appeared only in documents that corresponded to the periods of irregular tax collection from the Eastern Shore provinces, specifically in the years following Morel's introduction at court. She had not arrived at this knowledge quickly. She had arrived at it the way a person navigates difficult terrain in bad weather, one careful step at a time, testing the ground before committing her weight to it, going back and trying a different line when the footing wasn't solid. It had taken 4 years. 4 years of managing the household treasury personally, while Cedric found the subject tedious, of building quiet relationships with the royal archivist and 2 of the council's administrative clerks, of cultivating the kind of trust with her lady's maid that allowed certain documents to be carried from one part of the palace to another in the lining of a work basket without anyone thinking to look. She had not done it alone, but she had been careful about who she'd let in and how far, because the other thing she'd understood early was that allies were also vulnerabilities, and that you could lose everything you'd built the moment you misjudged who you could trust versus who you could use. Harwick Rain, for example, was a man she could use. She hadn't yet decided whether she could trust him, and the distinction mattered. But Mira came to her room after midnight. The festival noise had faded from the courtyard below. The musicians packed up, the lanterns extinguished in batches, the servants clearing the grounds in the particular exhausted silence of people who had worked since before dawn. Seraphine was at the writing table by the window, not writing, just sitting with a single candle, and the rain still coming down outside and a cup of cold tea she'd stopped noticing an hour ago. There's word from Aldrich Foss, Mira said from the doorway. Seraphine looked up. His man came to the kitchen entrance, said the governor requests a meeting, private. Mira's expression did not offer an opinion on this. It rarely did, which was part of what made her valuable. He says he has something for your eyes, said it came from the Eastern Customs Office, said you'd know what that meant. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain moved through the courtyard oak, and the branches shifted and resettled. I know what it means, she said. When should I tell his man? Tell him the day after tomorrow, the morning hour, before the council session. The East Library, not the formal receiving room. She thought for a moment. And not through his man. Send the message in person. Mira nodded. She started to turn away and then paused, because she had been with Seraphine for 11 years, and she understood when something else was still in the air. Your Majesty, she said. Quiet. Careful. Are you... I'm fine, Seraphine said. It wasn't quite true, but it was true enough for what needed doing, and she had learned long ago that the gap between those two things was where most of the actual work of living happened. Mira left. The candle burned. The rain kept falling. Seraphine thought about the umbrella, the ivory handle, the cream silk canopy, the weight of it in both hands for the full length of the processional route, while the crowd watched and Cedric laughed and Morel smiled with the settled ease of a woman who believed the ground under her was permanent. No ground was permanent. That was the first thing you learned when you stopped mourning and started paying attention. The things that looked most fixed, the king's authority, the favorite's position, the court's arrangement of loyalty, were just habits that hadn't been interrupted yet. Habits could be interrupted, but only if you understood exactly what was holding them in place, and only if you moved at the right moment, and only if what you used to interrupt them was clean enough and complete enough that there was no recovery from it. She was close. Closer than Morel knew, closer than Cedric knew, probably close enough that it had started to be dangerous in a new way, the way proximity to a finished thing creates its own kind of risk, because the temptation to move before the moment is ready becomes harder to resist the clearer the moment becomes. She picked up the cold tea and drank it, and made a face and set it back down. Not yet. Not yet. The next morning was clear. The storm had moved through and taken its fury elsewhere, and the capital sat under a pale autumn sky with the streets still slick and the air sharp enough to make breathing feel like a deliberate act. Seraphine walked the inner courtyard before the formal day began. 4 circuits, at a pace she'd maintained for 15 years, and boots she'd had resoled twice and intended to get more use out of before replacing them. She passed the old oak on the 3rd circuit. Several smaller branches had come down in the night, scattered across the stones. A pair of groundskeepers were gathering them up, working in silence, stacking the wet wood near the garden wall with the economical movements of men who'd done this before and would do it again, and had no particular feelings about it either way. One of them, older, paused in his work as she passed and looked up, not quite making eye contact, not the way servants were taught, but close. He had the kind of weathered face that belonged to a man who'd spent decades outdoors, and his expression held a quality she couldn't immediately identify. Not sympathy exactly. Something quieter, like a man confirming that something he'd thought was true about the world was still true. She gave him a small nod as she passed. He went back to his work. On her 4th circuit, she noticed Lord Theron Cress standing at the courtyard entrance, clearly intending to be noticed, but not quite committed enough to call out or approach directly. He was young enough to be uncertain about how to navigate the geometry of this situation, which was itself information about him. She walked toward him at the same pace and let him figure out what he meant to do. He waited until she was close and then said quietly and without preamble, "What happened yesterday was an insult to the crown, to the office, not just to you personally." A beat. I wanted to say that directly. She looked at him. 27 years old, still soft around the edges of his understanding of how courts worked, but with something underneath the softness that might be useful if it was given the right structure. He was watching her carefully, the way young men watch people they've identified as important and aren't sure yet how to approach correctly. "It was a festival," she said. "Arrangements shift." "Your Majesty, Lord Cress." Her voice didn't harden. It just stopped moving in the direction he was trying to take it. Thank you for your concern. The crown stands exactly where it stood yesterday. He didn't say anything else. She walked past him and felt his gaze follow her across the courtyard, and knew, without looking back, that he was standing there trying to figure out what she meant by that, and that he would spend considerable time doing so. That was fine. That was, in fact, useful. The message from Aldrich Foss's man had indicated Eastern Customs. The Eastern Customs Office controlled trade documentation for the coastal provinces, which were not under the Conrath family's formal jurisdiction, but which a particular tariff amendment, passed in the third year of Cedric's reign, presented to the council as a minor administrative simplification, had placed under a secondary review body whose composition Seraphine had pulled last spring and spent a very careful afternoon with. Of the 7 members of the secondary review body, 4 had financial relationships with entities she had already traced back to Conrath-adjacent holdings. The 5th was the father-in-law of Morel's cousin. The 6th was, as far as she could determine, genuinely neutral, a dull man from the northern counties who had been appointed to fill a seat and who attended meetings and signed documents without curiosity. The 7th was a woman named Delia Carr, retired from the Treasury, who had submitted a formal objection to the tariff amendment in the year it passed and been quietly removed from the advisory panel she'd sat on for 12 years 2 months later. Seraphine had written to Delia Carr. Not directly, nothing that could be called evidence of coordination, but through 3 careful intermediaries, the last of whom had approached Carr as a private archivist interested in historical trade documentation. Carr was not young, did not move quickly, and had taken 4 months to respond. When she did respond, she had sent 17 pages. Those 17 pages were currently stored behind the false back of the second shelf in the cipher room, inside the ivory-handled umbrella's carved base compartment. Not because that was a permanent hiding place, but because she had moved them there 2 weeks ago when one of the palace clerks had been too interested in the library's restricted stacks, and the umbrella's compartment was the fastest recess she'd had access to. She had intended to move them again, and had not yet found the right moment. The umbrella that Cedric had ordered her to carry yesterday through the rain in front of 3,000 people. She thought about this now, in the East Library, while she waited for the governor's meeting to begin. There was something almost too neat about it. The thing they'd used to humiliate her also happened to be the thing carrying the material that could end them. She didn't put much weight on that kind of symmetry. Symmetry was the kind of thing that sounded good in stories and was usually coincidence in life, and she couldn't afford to let herself start finding meaning in coincidences because that was how people made mistakes of timing. The umbrella wasn't symbolic of anything. It was a storage location. What it contained was what mattered. The library door opened. Aldrich Foss was 56, with the careful, slightly compressed bearing of a man who had spent a career managing the gap between what he knew and what it was safe to say he knew. He was not a bold man. He was, however, a precise one, and precision in the right hands was worth considerably more than boldness. He closed the door himself. Didn't sit immediately. "Your Majesty," he said, "I'll say directly that what I've come to discuss is not a small thing, and that I wouldn't be here if I wasn't certain enough of what I'm about to hand you to stake my governorship on it." A pause. "Or more than my governorship." "Sit down, Aldrich," she said. He sat. He reached into his coat and removed a folded document. Thick, sealed with an unfamiliar mark, soft at the edges in the way of something that had been handled carefully over a long transit. He set it on the table between them. "It came through the Eastern Customs verification post 6 days ago," he said. "A routine shipment manifest. Except one of my men, a man I've had in that post for 8 years, a man I trust, flagged a discrepancy. The cargo registry listed goods in a volume that exceeded the declared vessel capacity." He looked at her steadily, by a factor that made the error too large to be an error. So he pulled the secondary manifest, the one that should have matched. "It didn't," Seraphine said. The secondary manifest bore the authentication seal of the review body. He said those 2 words, review body, with a kind of careful precision that communicated that he knew exactly what they meant, and that he wanted her to know that he knew. Authorized for reduced tariff passage, signed by a body that, as far as the public record goes, convened twice last year and produced nothing controversial. Seraphine picked up the document. The seal on it was the one she expected. The signature beneath was the one she'd been looking for 14 months. "How many shipments?" she said. "My man has tracked it back 2 years, what he's been able to access. He estimates, conservatively, that the revenue difference over that period is substantial enough to explain a good part of the municipal shortfall in 3 coastal provinces." She opened the folded pages. The figures were clear. They were, in fact, very clear, in a way that suggested whoever had built this system had not expected anyone to look in exactly this place and ask exactly this question. That was the particular arrogance of people who'd been successful long enough to stop imagining failure. "Your man," she said. "Where is he now?" "I've moved him. He's with my household staff away from the post. He won't be connected to this document." "And you?" Foss's expression didn't change significantly. "I'm here, Your Majesty. That's where I am." She looked at him for a long moment. A man who had made a calculation. Not a reckless one. Foss didn't make reckless calculations. But a significant one. The kind that acknowledged that the current arrangement was not stable and that the direction of the eventual instability mattered enormously for people in his position. "There will be more," she said. "Not a question." "I think there will be considerably more," he said, "if the right doors open." "The right doors will open," she said, "but not yet, and not quickly, and not visibly." She set the document down, picked it up again. "When I move, I will need your confirmation, in front of the council, on record." Foss was quiet for a moment that contained, she thought, a complete recalculation of the risks involved in what he was doing in this room. "Yes," he said. One word. She believed it. She went back to the cipher room that afternoon, alone. The umbrella was where she'd left it, standing in the corner behind the reference shelves, where it looked like something that had been set down absently and not retrieved. She took it out and checked the compartment in the carved handle. Delia Carr's 17 pages were intact, dry, exactly as she'd left them. She set Foss's document in beside them, felt the weight of the thing in her hands, silk and ivory and carved wood, and paper that could dismantle a throne. She stayed there for a while in the quiet room with the weak afternoon light coming through the single high window and the sound of the palace going about its business on the other side of the door. She thought about the rain, the way it had felt on the back of her neck, running in cold lines down under her collar, the way Cedric's laughter had moved through it, easy and certain, the laughter of a man who believed his certainties were permanent, the way Morel had walked beside him, unhurried, protected, the silk canopy angled exactly right, not a drop of water on her midnight blue gown, while the rightful queen of the Ashcroft kingdom stood in the downpour with swelling feet inside wet shoes and a face that betrayed nothing. There was a kind of power in being underestimated. She had understood this for a long time. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't, in any ordinary sense of the word, good, but it was functional. It created space. It allowed movement. People who were watched carefully had no room to maneuver. People who had been written off as broken were invisible in the way that turned out to matter. She put the umbrella back in its corner. There was still work to do. Harwick Rain. The 2 council clerks who she believed could be brought across, but who she hadn't yet committed to approaching, because commitment at the wrong moment was a liability. The question of Theron Cress. Whether his outrage was a resource or a risk. The cipher room documents, which would need to be consolidated and moved again, somewhere they could be produced publicly on very short notice when the moment arrived. The moment. It was not now. But she could feel it the way you could feel weather. That pressure change. That quality in the air that had nothing to do with what you could see and everything to do with what was coming. 3 days later, a palace messenger arrived at her chambers at mid-morning with a sealed note bearing the king's personal mark. She broke the seal, read the 3 lines inside. The festival council had approved the king's request for a formal throne ceremony. The date was set for the following week. The ceremony would mark an official royal declaration regarding the succession status of the child Mirel Conrath carried. In all but legal name, the note was announcing that Cedric intended to move against the existing line of succession. In front of the court, publicly. as fast as he thought he could manage it. Seraphine read the 3 lines twice. She folded the note exactly in half and set it on the table in front of her. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. Behind her eyes, something that was not quite fear and not quite readiness, but occupied the narrow ground between them, moved through her chest like the first edge of a very serious storm. He was moving faster than she'd expected. And if he moved at the ceremony, if he made a public declaration before she was fully ready, before the documents were consolidated, before she'd brought Rain across, he would create a legal situation that might be reversible, but that reversal would cost twice what it would cost now, and the cost wouldn't fall on him. She had days, not weeks. She picked up the note, walked to the cipher room, placed it behind the false shelf beside Delia Carr's 17 pages and Aldrich Foss's customs document, and closed the compartment in the handle of an ivory umbrella. Then she sent for Mira. "Find out," she said when Mira appeared in the doorway, "when Harwick Rain takes his evening walk. And where?" Mira looked at her. Just for a second, that question again behind her eyes. "He walks the western battlement wall," Seraphine said quietly, answering what hadn't been asked. "He's done it every evening for 20 years. He goes alone." A pause. "I'll go alone as well," she said. "Tonight." And somewhere in the palace behind her, in a room she had never entered and would not enter uninvited, Lady Morel Conrath was laughing at something, and the sound of it moved through the stone walls with all the ease of a woman who didn't yet know that the ground beneath her had already started to give. The western battlement wall ran the full length of the palace's outer ring on the left flank. A long, exposed walkway of pale stone, with the city dropping away on one side, and the inner courtyard gardens below on the other, the kind of place that was technically accessible but that most of the palace staff avoided after dark because the wind off the northern range found it easily and didn't let go. Harwick Rain walked it every evening. Had for 20 years, Seraphine had been told, and what she'd observed in the 3 months she'd been paying attention confirmed it. He went alone, without a lantern, in the same heavy wool coat regardless of season, at the same hour. An hour after the formal supper ended, before the palace settled fully into night. He walked the length once in each direction and came back in through the same door he'd left by. He was a man of deeply fixed habits. She had found, over 20 years of navigating a court, that men of fixed habits were often men with something they needed to hold still, some part of themselves that required the repetition of known motion to stay organized. Understanding what that was in Rain had taken time. She believed she understood it now. She went up through the servant's stair, quicker, less visible, and came out through the north access door onto the battlement wall at a point roughly 2/3 along its length. The wind hit her immediately, cold and blunt, carrying the smell of the city below and the distant hills and the particular sharpness of stone that had been rained on and not yet dried. She stood there and waited. He came around the far corner 4 minutes later, moving at his usual pace, steady and deliberate, the walk of a man covering ground he'd covered 1,000 times. He saw her from 30 feet out and didn't slow or alter his line. He walked directly toward her and stopped at a distance that was close enough for conversation and far enough to have not yet committed to it. For a moment neither of them said anything. The wind moved between them. Below, the courtyard gardens were dark shapes in the faint yellow light of groundskeeper lanterns. "Your Majesty," Rain said. "Walk with me," she said. He fell into step beside her. They walked toward the north end of the wall, and the silence between them was the particular kind that has content, not empty, not uncomfortable, but full of something that both parties are aware of and neither has yet named. Rain spoke first. "This isn't a coincidence." "No," she said. "I assume you know about the ceremony." "I received the king's note this morning." He made a sound that was not quite a word, a short exhale through the nose that communicated something between contempt and exhaustion. "He's moving fast." "Faster than he should," she said, "which means he's not worried about resistance." "No." A pause. "He's not." She let that sit for a moment. Below, a groundskeeper moved between the garden paths with a lantern, the light swinging in a small, slow arc. She watched it. "What would change that?" she said. Rain stopped walking. She stopped as well 2 paces later and turned back to face him. He was looking at her with an expression that was doing a great deal of work, managing, assessing, deciding something that had probably been approaching this decision for a long time and was now at the point of arrival. "What you're asking me," he said, "is whether I'd put my name on something. I'm asking you what it would take for the king to be worried about resistance." "That's the same question." "It is," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Harwick Rain had survived 4 king's courts, had outlasted 3 council reorganizations, 2 border crises, and 1 attempted coup that was now officially referred to in the court records as an administrative irregularity. He had not survived all of that by being fast. He had survived it by being certain. "What do you have?" he said. She had thought carefully about this. How much to give him tonight, at what point in the conversation, in what order. Not because she didn't trust him enough to eventually tell him everything, but because the sequence in which information was offered changed how it was received, and she needed him to understand the weight of it before he knew the details. Because if he understood the weight first, the details would land correctly. "Customs documentation," she said. 2 years of irregular tariff passage through the Eastern Review Body. Trade volumes that don't match vessel capacity. Revenue shortfalls in 3 coastal provinces that can now be sourced. He was very still. "Authentication seals," she continued. "From a body whose composition, if someone were to pull it, would be interesting to the right people." "How solid?" "Solid enough that the man who found it has been moved out of his post for his own safety." Rain's jaw shifted. Not dramatically. Just a small movement, the kind a man makes when something confirms what he'd suspected, and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. "Boss," he said. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. "There's more," she said. "Correspondence, payment records, forged secondary documents in the council archive that I can trace back to the amendment period." She paused. "Enough that if it were produced in front of the full council with the right confirmation, it doesn't just damage them," Rain said. He wasn't asking. "No," she said. "It ends them." The wind came hard off the north range, and the lantern below swung in a wide arc and steadied. Rain looked out over the city for a long moment, his hands behind his back, and Seraphine watched his face and read it the way she read everything. Not for what it was doing on the surface, but for what the surface was managing. He was afraid. Not of her, not of the information. He was afraid of the gap between the world as it currently was and the world that the information she was describing would produce, because that gap was the most dangerous territory a person could cross, and he was 58 years old, and he had crossed difficult territory before and knew exactly what it cost. But underneath the fear was something else, something she'd identified weeks ago, the first time she'd caught his expression at a council session when Mirel's family name came up in relation to a trade charter amendment. Something that looked like a man who had been asked to sign his name below a line he found intolerable and had done it, and who had not been able to put it down since. "The ceremony is in 6 days," she said. "I know. If he makes the declaration in front of the court, I know what it means." His voice was flat, controlled. "I've read enough succession law to know what a public royal declaration in front of witnesses creates, even if the council objects afterward." He turned back to look at her. "You're telling me the window is 6 days. I'm telling you the window is 6 days. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She had learned, over 20 years, that there were moments in negotiations, and most things between people were negotiations of one kind or another, where speaking was a loss, and the person who stayed quiet longest was the person who was serious. She stayed quiet. "What do you need from me?" he said. "The night of the ceremony," she said. "I need you in that room, and I need you ready to speak on record when the documents are produced." "That's a significant ask." "Yes." If it goes wrong, she said, "we're both already past the point of safety by having this conversation. I'm aware of that. I assume you are as well." Another long look, the wind pressed between them. "All right," he said. He said it the way she'd said, "I'm fine," to Mira. Not quite the whole truth, but true enough for what needed doing. She understood that. She accepted it. They walked back in silence, the length of the wall in the direction they'd come, and parted at the north access door without ceremony, and Seraphine went down through the servants' stair with the cold wind still moving through her hair and her heartbeat steady and even in her chest, and thought about 6 days. Old. She spent the next 2 days in careful motion, not visible motion, nothing that would draw eyes, nothing that looked like preparation for anything. She attended the morning council briefing and sat in her place and contributed 3 minor observations about the Eastern harvest, yield projections that were, in fact, minor. She took her afternoon walk in the inner garden. She accepted an invitation to tea from Lady Aldous, the wife of the Northern Council seat, and spent an hour in that woman's receiving room discussing the quality of the year's wool exports with total apparent sincerity. Underneath all of it, she moved. Theron Cress was easier than she'd expected. She hadn't sought him out directly. That would have been too visible, too easily misread. Instead, she'd let Mira make an observation in the right hallway, at the right moment, within earshot of the young lord's senior attendant, that certain documents relating to Eastern trade oversight might be of interest to members of the junior council who were developing their portfolios in commercial law. 3 hours later, Cress had appeared at the East Library on a pretext thin enough to be transparent, and she had spoken with him for 40 minutes. He was exactly what she'd thought. Idealistic enough to be genuinely angry, ambitious enough to understand that the anger could be useful, and just experienced enough to be scared of how far this went. She gave him the same sequence she'd given Rain, wait first, details second, and watched him absorb it with the particular intensity of a young man who has just understood that something he thought was small is actually very large. "What do you need from me?" he said at the end, different from Rain's version of the same question. Rain had asked it like a man committing to a debt he already understood the size of. Cress asked it like a man who wanted to be useful and was still calculating what useful cost. "Your presence," she said. "Your voice, if I ask for it. Your memory of this conversation, which you will not share with anyone." A pause. "And your silence between now and the ceremony." He nodded. "You'll have all of it." She believed him. Not because he was reliable in the general sense, she didn't know him well enough for that, but because he was angry enough that his anger would hold him in place until the moment came. Anger, directed correctly and given a target, was a better anchor than most things. She needed 2 more council members to make the confirmation complete enough that it couldn't be dismissed as a faction. She had Foss. She had Rain. If she could bring one of the senior council clerks, the woman named Esther, who had spent 18 years in the administrative archive and who Seraphine had cultivated quietly through 2 intermediaries, she would have what she needed. Esther was the careful one. Esther had built a life on staying invisible in exactly the right ways, on being the person who knew where everything was without ever being the person who was blamed for what anything contained. She was 53 and had 2 daughters and a husband who worked in the city assessor's office, and she had, as far as Seraphine could tell, spent 18 years in the Royal Archive developing a comprehensive and largely private understanding of exactly how much of the court's business had been conducted in ways that wouldn't survive scrutiny. Mira facilitated the contact, 2 steps removed, carefully indirect. The meeting itself was brief, in the archive itself, which Esther chose and which Seraphine found appropriate. Esther sat across a work table covered in bound ledgers and looked at Seraphine with the eyes of a woman who had been waiting for a specific kind of conversation for a long time and was not quite sure whether to be relieved or frightened that it had arrived. "I know what you've been building," Esther said before Seraphine had gotten more than 2 sentences in. Seraphine stopped. "How much do you know?" "Enough to have stayed very quiet," Esther said. "Enough to know that what you have and what I have, put together, closes every door they might use." She looked at Seraphine steadily. "I have the original draft of the tariff amendment, the one before the final version, the one that has the notation in the margin in a handwriting I can identify." A pause. "And I have the confirmation request that was sent to a third party before the amendment was formally introduced, which means it was written before the council vote, which means the vote was—" "Already decided," Seraphine said. "The vote was theater," Esther said flatly. The word landed in the quiet archive room with a weight that was almost physical. Not because it was a surprise, Seraphine had suspected it for 2 years, but because having it confirmed by someone who had held the original documents in their hands was a different thing from suspecting it. It closed the architecture. It made the structure complete. She looked at Esther across the ledger-covered table and felt something shift in her chest. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter and colder than either. The feeling of a door swinging fully open onto a room you'd known was there, but hadn't yet been able to enter. "I'll need you to be willing to speak to that," she said. "On record, in the council chamber." "I know," Esther said. "I've known for 2 years what it would eventually come to." She looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up. "My daughters are grown." Seraphine understood what that meant. It wasn't a condition. It was a woman locating herself in the situation, confirming that she had calculated what she was risking and where the edges of that risk fell. "Yes," Seraphine said simply. They sat in the archive for a few more minutes, and Seraphine felt the shape of the things she'd built across 4 years. The governors, and the generals, and the archive clerks, and the customs men, and the retired treasury advisor, and the young lord with his useful anger, and the old general with his carefully managed fear. She felt the shape of it settle into something that held the way a structure settles when the last component is in place and the load is finally distributed correctly. But what? On the 5th day before the ceremony, Cedric came to her rooms. He didn't often. Once, early in the marriage, she had thought his visits were attempts at something. Reconnection, maybe, or a specific kind of reassurance. The kind a man seeks when he needs someone to confirm that he is still the person he believes himself to be. That interpretation hadn't survived long. His visits were administrative. He came when there was something he needed her to perform. A public appearance, a court function, a presentation he needed a queen for rather than a mistress. She received him in the outer sitting room. He stood rather than sat, which was itself a choice. It put her at the disadvantage of being seated while he moved, but she had stopped finding his physical positioning choices threatening the way she once had, because she had understood that he used space the way he used everything, to feel large in the immediate moment without thinking about what came after. "The ceremony details have been finalized," he said, without preamble. He had his formal voice on, not the easy warmth he used with Morel, not the contempt he sometimes let slip in private, but the clipped official register of a man conducting business. "You'll be in attendance, standard court placement." "Of course," she said. "There'll be a formal address before the declaration. I expect the full council to be present." He looked at her, a quick assessing look she recognized. He was checking for something, some indication of what she was planning to do. He did this periodically. It was the one instinct about her that still occasionally functioned correctly. The awareness that her silences were not the same as compliance. He just had not been able to do anything useful with the awareness because he'd never fully understood what the silence contained. "That's a significant event," she said. "Is there anything you need from me in preparation?" He studied her, looking for the thing under the surface. "No," he said, "just your presence." "You'll have it," she said. He left. She stayed seated in the outer room for a moment after he was gone, listening to his footsteps move away down the corridor, and then she went to the cipher room and stood with the umbrella in her hands and looked at the document she'd been building for 4 years and thought about 5 days. 4 years. 4 years of walking in the rain of this marriage, not just the literal rain in the courtyard, not just the public scenes and the visible humiliations, but the daily sustained pressure of being a person in a situation that was designed to unmake you, and finding in yourself not the absence of pain but the refusal to let pain be the organizing principle, the refusal to let what was being done to you define what you would do. She put the umbrella back, carefully, in its corner. 5 days. And on the 4th day, a message arrived from a source she hadn't expected, delivered through a channel she didn't recognize, unsealed, written in a hand she'd never seen before, but that included a piece of identifying information that confirmed its origin beyond doubt. The message was 4 lines. She read it twice. Then she stood very still in the middle of her chamber with the paper in her hand and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that was not a metaphor. Her actual physical equilibrium altered, something in her inner ear responding to information that her nervous system was processing before her mind had finished understanding it. The message was from inside the Conrath household. It named the location of a secondary set of documents, ones she hadn't known existed, held by a member of Morel's own family who had, according to the message, grown uncomfortable enough with the direction of the enterprise to have held something back. A contingency, the message suggested. Insurance, documents that, if authentic and if accessible, would make what she already had look like preliminary evidence. She read the message a third time. Then she went to find Mira, moving faster than she'd moved in 4 years, because there were now 4 days until the ceremony, and the architecture she'd built had just grown a room she hadn't planned for, and she needed to know whether the floor of that room would hold. The message had come from a name she didn't recognize, Sable, written at the bottom in a hand that was careful and small, the kind of hand that had been trained to leave as little of itself as possible on the page. Mira had been the one to receive it. She had brought it without comment, which meant she had read it, which meant she had made a calculation about its credibility before carrying it across the palace and putting it in Seraphine's hands. Mira did not deliver things she believed were traps. She delivered things she was uncertain about and let Seraphine decide. The fact that she had brought it at all meant she thought it was real. Seraphine had read it 3 times in the cipher room, alone, with the umbrella in the corner and the documents behind the false shelf, and 4 days between her and the ceremony. Then she had gone to find Mira, and the two of them had spent an hour in the back room of the Queen's suite, the small one with no windows that Seraphine used for nothing else, talking through the identifying detail in the message, the piece of information that confirmed the sender had access to something internal, something that could not have been guessed or constructed from outside. "It's a woman," Mira said. "The hand is a woman's, trained hand, not a servant." "Conrath household staff wouldn't have this information," Seraphine said. "It has to be someone with direct access to the family's private correspondence." "A companion," Mira said. "Or a secretary." "Or family," Seraphine said. "A member who was never fully committed and has been watching the direction of things." Mira was quiet for a moment. "Or it's an invitation into a room that's already been prepared." Seraphine looked at her. "Yes," she said. "That's the other thing it could be." The problem with intelligence that arrived unexpectedly was that its value and its danger were identical until you'd verified it, and verification required exposure. You had to go far enough toward the thing to confirm it was real before you could use it, and going that far meant accepting a period of vulnerability that didn't exist if you stayed where you were. She stayed where she was for 2 days. She did not make contact. She completed her other preparations, consolidated the documents, confirmed the arrangements with Ryan through a channel that required no direct communication, sent word to Foss through the same method. She spoke with Esther again, briefly, in the archive, and established the precise sequence in which the materials would be produced if everything went as planned. She did not contact the Conrath source. She let the message sit. On the 3rd day before the ceremony, a second message arrived. Same hand, shorter. It said, "The documents exist. I will bring them to you directly. Name the place and hour." She read it and felt the pull of it. The specific gravity of information that would make an already solid case into something irrefutable, that would close every angle of defense, that would make the outcome not just likely, but certain. 4 years of careful work had taught her to want certainty. The problem was that certainty was exactly the thing that traps were designed to promise. She thought about it for most of a day. Then she named the place and hour. The servant's entrance to the east wing after the evening meal, using the passage that ran behind the kitchen stores. Private enough to be credible for a source trying to avoid detection. Not so isolated that there was no reasonable exit. She went alone. She had told no one. Not Mira, not Rain, not Foss. If it was a trap, she didn't want anyone else caught in it. If it wasn't a trap, the fewer people who knew about the meeting and its source, the better. The passage behind the kitchen stores smelled of dried grain and lamp oil. There was one small lantern at the far end, barely enough to see by. She arrived first and stood in the dark of the passage and listened to the kitchen sounds coming through the wall, the clatter and voices of the evening cleanup, and thought about what she was doing, which was the kind of thinking that was mostly checking and rechecking the reasoning that had already been done, because the decision was made and what thinking served now was steadiness rather than analysis. The door at the far end opened. A woman came through. She was about 30, plainly dressed, not servant's dress, not noble dress, something between, the kind of clothing that made it easy to move through the palace without being categorized. She had dark eyes, and the careful face of a person managing a significant amount of fear with a significant amount of will. She stopped when she saw Seraphine and stayed near the door, which was its own kind of information. She had kept her exit close. "Sable," Seraphine said. "Yes." The woman's voice was low and steady. "I work for Mirel's cousin. I have for 6 years. I've seen everything." She paused. "I kept copies." "Why?" The woman's jaw moved. "Because I'm not stupid," she said. "Because I watched where this was going and I wanted something that made me harder to remove than a letter of dismissal." "Insurance," Seraphine said. "Yes." "And now you're offering it to me, which means your insurance has stopped protecting you." The woman's eyes moved. A quick assessment, checking whether Seraphine was accusing her of something or simply identifying a fact. "The cousin," she said. "He found out I'd kept copies. I have maybe a week before it becomes a problem." She reached into the folded cloth she was carrying and removed a package, bound with plain cord, sealed with wax that bore no mark. "Take it." Seraphine crossed the passage and took the package. It was heavier than she'd expected. She didn't open it. "What's in here?" "Correspondence between Mirel's family and 2 council members, not the ones you know about." A pause. "Different names." Seraphine went very still. "Payment records going back 4 years," the woman continued, "and a letter in Mirel's own hand that was never sent, that describes in detail the arrangement for the amendment vote." She looked at Seraphine directly. "It names the king." The kitchen sounds came through the wall, somewhere distant, a door. "The king was part of the vote arrangement," Seraphine said. "He authorized the secondary review body's composition," the woman said. "Not publicly, not on record, but the letter confirms he knew what the body was for before it was convened. What had looked for 4 years like a conspiracy running alongside the throne was not alongside the throne at all. It was through it. Cedric had not been manipulated by Mirel's family. He had been a knowing participant in the architecture. The corruption was not adjacent to the king. It was structured around him with his consent from the beginning. She stood in the passage with the package in her hands and let this land. Let it change the shape of what she'd built, what she'd thought she'd understood, how the whole 4 years needed to be reread in a different light. Then she said, "Who else knows this?" "No one," the woman said. "Not anymore." Seraphine looked at her. "Where will you go?" "Away from the capital," the woman said. "Tonight, if I can." "Take the northern road. My name will open the checkpoint if you need it." She paused. "You have my word that these are used only for what they're meant for." The woman nodded once. She looked like she wanted to say something else and decided against it. She turned and went back through the door she'd come in by, and the passage was quiet again. Seraphine stood in the dark with the package and rearranged everything. She went back to the cipher room and opened it there, alone, with the door bolted and the single candle and her hand steady on the cord. The contents were exactly what the woman had described. She went through each piece methodically, setting things in order, reading each one fully before moving to the next, building the complete picture in the correct sequence rather than grabbing for the most significant pieces first. Methodical was the only way through something like this. Methodical was the only thing that kept the ground under her feet when the ground had just substantially shifted. The letter in Mirel's hand was the last thing she read. It was not long. 2 pages, written in a hand that was precise and slightly compressed, the kind of writing that comes from someone who thinks faster than they can get words down. It described the composition of the secondary review body and its intended function. It described the revenue arrangement and how the proceeds were divided. It mentioned the king by name, not as Cedric, not as his majesty, but by a short, informal name that indicated a familiarity that was itself a piece of information. And in the final paragraph, in language that was specific enough to be admissible and direct enough to require no interpretation, it confirmed that he had reviewed the plan, approved it, and suggested the particular tariff amendment language that would make the scheme most difficult to trace. It was not a weapon she had built. It was a weapon that had been handed to her through a door she hadn't known was there. She sat with it for a long time. The king was not a secondary figure in the corruption she'd been documenting. He was its architect, which meant that what she'd been preparing, a case that would expose Morel's family and create the conditions for a council removal of an incompetent king, was not the case she actually had. The case she actually had was larger, more severe, and required a different kind of movement, faster and more complete, because a king who knew a case was being built against him and who had been a willing participant in 4 years of systematic fraud would not wait passively for the council to act. If Cedric found out she had this letter before the ceremony, she stopped that line of thinking. It led to a place that wasn't useful right now. She put everything back in order. She added the new documents to the existing ones in the umbrella's compartment and stood with the thing in her hands and thought about the ceremony. 3 days. 3 days to restructure the presentation, brief Reen and Foss on what the new evidence changed, and determine whether Esther's archive materials now needed to be produced in a different sequence to account for the king's direct involvement. She was still sitting there working through the sequence when she heard the knock on the cipher room door. Not Mira's knock. Different rhythm. She put the umbrella back in the corner. She moved the documents back behind the false shelf. She crossed the room and unbolted the door and opened it. Theron Cress was standing in the corridor. He was not composed. His face had the particular dishevelment of someone who had come quickly from somewhere they hadn't expected to be leaving, and his eyes were doing the thing eyes did when a person had just received information that had reorganized the structure of their understanding of something important. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment, and in that moment she read him, the specific quality of what was on his face, and understood that something had gone wrong. "Tell me," she said. He came inside. She closed the door. He didn't wait. "Esther," he said. She was called to a council administrative review this afternoon, unscheduled. 2 senior council officers and a royal clerk. He looked at her directly. They asked her about the archive access logs, specifically the restricted stacks, specifically the access dates that corresponded to... He stopped. Started again. She held. She gave them nothing, but they took her access credentials. Seraphine's chest was very still. "They know someone has been in the restricted stacks," Cress said. "They don't know what was found, but they're looking." A pause. The review was authorized by the Royal Household Office. Not the Council. The Royal Household Office. Which meant Cedric. Which meant someone had told him. Not what, not the specifics Esther had held, but enough. That someone had been looking. That the archive had been accessed. That the records weren't clean. "Who else was questioned?" she said. "I don't know. Esther sent word to me through her daughter. She couldn't reach..." He stopped. "She couldn't reach anyone else. The channels are being watched." Seraphine stood in the cipher room and calculated. The window had just changed. 3 days before the ceremony had felt like enough. Tight, but manageable, with the new evidence and the restructured presentation. But if Cedric was now actively looking, if the royal household was monitoring the channels she'd built over 4 years, "How long ago was the review?" she said. 2 hours. She looked at him. "Go back to your rooms. Normal pace. Don't stop anywhere. Don't speak to anyone. If anyone asks where you've been, you were in the library reviewing the provincial charter records. That's checkable and clean. Can you do that?" "Yes." "Tomorrow morning, the East Garden, your normal walk if you take one." "I take one every morning." "I'll be there." She looked at him steadily. "Don't come here again." He left. She closed the door and stood in the cipher room alone with the candle and the umbrella in the corner and the reorganized architecture of 4 years of work, and the understanding that the floor she'd been building on had just revealed itself to have a crack she hadn't known was there. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a crack that ran through the center of the foundation, and that she had 2 hours at most before Cedric's people worked their way closer to what they were looking for. She went to the false shelf. She took out all the documents, Carr's 17 pages, Foss's customs records, the message from Sable, and Morel's letter. And she stood with them in her arms and thought about where to move them, because the cipher room was no longer safe, because the channels were being watched, because the thing she'd spent 4 years building quietly in the dark had just been seen. Not enough to stop her. but enough to require a different kind of movement. She thought about the umbrella, the ivory handle, the compartment in the carved base. The ceremony was in 3 days. She had been prepared to move carefully, with precision, at the appointed hour, with every piece in its correct place and every person ready for their part. She had been prepared for the version of this that went the way she'd planned it. What she was facing now was not that version. What she was facing now was a choice between two things that were both bad, and one of which was survivable. Move before she was ready, with some pieces out of place and some people not fully briefed, and take the risk that the presentation was incomplete. Or wait, stay the course, hold to the plan, and take the risk that Cedric found what he was looking for before she reached the ceremony. She had spent 4 years being the person who waited for the right moment. She stood in the cipher room and understood, with the specific clarity of a person who has been patient long enough to recognize when patience has become its own liability, that the right moment was no longer in 3 days. The right moment was now, because she still had the documents and the witnesses and the window, and every hour she waited was an hour that window narrowed, and narrowing windows did not reopen. She put the documents back in the umbrella's compartment and made the only calculation that still mattered: who she could reach tonight, what she could produce tomorrow, and whether what she had, all of it, including Morel's letter and the king's name in it, was enough to walk into a room she hadn't planned to enter yet, in front of people who weren't prepared for it, and make it hold. She believed it was. She picked up the umbrella. She walked out of the cipher room into the dark corridor with 4 years of evidence in her hands, and the ceremony 3 days away, and the king's people 2 hours behind her, and she moved toward the only ending that was still available. Not the one she'd built, but the one the situation required, and in that particular terrible clarity, something she hadn't felt in years settled into her chest like iron finding its correct shape. Not anger, not fear, purpose, stripped of everything but its function. She walked. She reached Rain first, not through the channels that were being watched, not through Mira's usual routes, or the kitchen passage, or any of the established lines she'd built over 4 years, because those were the lines Cedric's people were now moving along, and using a compromised channel was the same as sending a letter directly to the person you were trying to avoid. She reached Rain the only way left, directly, on foot, through the servants' corridor that connected the east wing to the old garrison quarters where he kept his private rooms when he wasn't in the main palace block. She walked fast. Not running. Running in a palace corridor at this hour was a declaration that something was wrong, and declarations were what she couldn't afford right now. But fast, with the umbrella tucked against her body under her outer cloak, and the cold stone of the corridor floor coming up through the soles of her boots, and her breathing even and deliberate and quiet. She knocked on his door. 3 times, the specific rhythm she'd established the night on the battlement wall. She heard him move on the other side, and then the bolt drew back and the door opened, and he looked at her face and stepped aside without asking. She came in. He closed the door. The room was lit by a single lamp. He'd been awake, sitting at the desk with papers she didn't look at, because they weren't relevant to the next few minutes. The archive access was flagged, she said. Royal Household authorized a review 2 hours ago. Esther held, but they took her credentials. The channels are being watched. Rain's face went through something quick and controlled. How close are they? Close enough that I'm here instead of sending word. She looked at him steadily. The ceremony is in 3 days. We can't wait for it. He was quiet for a moment that had the quality of a man doing rapid structural engineering in his head, calculating loads, identifying failure points, testing the weight of what was being proposed against what he knew of the ground it would have to stand on. When? He said. Tomorrow. The morning council session. She watched his face. It's the only time the full council is assembled without it being a ceremonial event, without a stage already set for something else. And it's the only window before he gets close enough to what he's looking for that it stops being our move and becomes his. Tomorrow is too fast, Rain said. Foss isn't briefed on the changes. I'll reach Foss tonight. The presentation order needs restructuring if the king is directly implicated. I know. I've been through it. The Morel letter goes last, not first. We build the institutional case, confirm the review body corruption, establish the revenue fraud, and produce the letter as the closing piece when the council has already reached a verdict on the subordinate charges. That sequence holds better than leading with the king. He looked at her. You've been through it. In my head, for the last hour. She met his eyes. It holds, Harwick. It's not the approach I wanted, but it holds. He was quiet again. Then he said, What's your read on the council? Without the 3 days of positioning. Foss is committed, Cress is committed, you are committed. A beat. Of the remaining council members, I believe 4 will follow the evidence if it's presented by people they trust. 2 are Conrath adjacent but not formally compromised. They'll read the room before they move. The rest are appointment men. They go with the weight of the room. And if the king is in the room when we produce the letter, he'll be in the room, she said. That's not a problem. That's the point. Rain put both hands flat on the desk and looked at the surface of it and breathed. It was the breathing of a man accepting something he'd already decided to accept and just needing a moment to let the acceptance settle into his body. All right, he said. What do you need from me tonight? Send word to the council secretary that you're calling an emergency procedural session for the morning hour. Use the standing military oversight provision. It's your right as senior military advisor. It doesn't require the king's pre-approval, and it gets the full council in the chamber before Cedric has time to structure the room in his favor. Rain looked up. The military oversight provision, that's a significant call to make. Yes, she said. If the evidence doesn't land the way you expect, if it doesn't land, she said, we're both already past the point where the provision is the biggest problem we have. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, and she left. She found Foss through his household steward, the one man in Foss's operation she'd identified as a safe contact, a quiet man in his 50s who had been with the governor for 20 years and who understood that certain things needed to move without leaving traces. She gave the steward 6 sentences and sent him back. 20 minutes later, Foss appeared at the east wing side entrance in a heavy coat and the expression of a man who had been pulled out of sleep by something serious and had made peace with that fact during the walk over. She walked him through the new evidence in the passage behind the kitchen stores. The same passage where she'd met Sable 2 nights ago, which felt like a different era now. She told him about Morel's letter. She told him about the king's name in it. She told him the sequence had changed and why. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, You're sure of the letter? I've read it. The hand has been confirmed by a source with direct knowledge of Morel's personal correspondence. And the source? Gone from the capital. Foss looked at the passage wall. His jaw worked. He was part of it from the beginning, he said. Not a question, confirming something he'd suspected and had been unwilling to fully commit to. From before the beginning, she said. The amendment language came from him. Another long silence. Tomorrow morning, he said. The military oversight session. Rain is calling it. And Cress. I'll reach him before dawn. She looked at Foss directly. Aldrich. When I produce the letter, when his name is in it and the room understands what that means, I need you to speak first. He looked at her. Why first? Because you're the governor of the southern provinces and you represent a territorial interest that predates this king's appointment. Because your voice carries a different kind of authority than mine in that room. Because when the council sees the letter and looks to understand what it means for the next 10 minutes of their lives, the first voice they hear will shape the direction of every voice that follows. Foss's face was doing something that was not quite fear and not quite resolve, but occupied the narrow strip between them. She recognized it. She'd felt it herself in the cipher room when she'd made the decision to move. All right, he said, I'll speak first. She went back through the east wing and up the servants' stair and knocked on Cress's door with 40 minutes left before the kitchen staff would begin their pre-dawn preparation, which meant 40 minutes before the corridors started filling with people and movement became visible. He answered quickly. He had not been sleeping. Tomorrow morning, she said. She looked at him. He was pale and sharp-eyed, and his youth was showing in the way his hands were moving, not quite steady, the hands of someone whose body had correctly identified that something very large was in motion. The council chamber. Rain is calling an emergency session. You will be there. I'll be there, he said. What do I do? Watch, she said. Until I ask you to speak. Then you speak exactly what you know, in the exact order you know it, without embellishment and without hesitation. She paused. Can you do that? Yes. Cress. She held his gaze. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, whatever the king says, whatever anyone says, you finish what you start. You don't stop in the middle. You don't look at anyone else to take the weight of it for you. A beat. You understand? He held her gaze back. Something settled in his face. Not confidence exactly, but the thing that comes just before confidence when a young man locates something in himself that he isn't sure was there until the moment he needs it. I understand, he said. She left him and went back to her rooms and sat at the writing table by the window in the last dark hour before the capital woke up and did not sleep and did not try to. The morning came gray and cold. She dressed carefully. The dark burgundy again, the same gown she'd worn in the rain during the harvest festival procession, because she was not a woman who believed in symbols as a general principle, but she understood that symbols worked on people, that what an audience saw first shaped how they received everything that came after, and walking into that council chamber in the gown from the procession was a piece of information she could give the room for free. Mira helped her with the iron combs. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that hadn't been understood. She carried the umbrella under her arm when she left her rooms. It was too conspicuous. A queen carrying an umbrella through the palace at the morning hour was the kind of thing that people noticed and repeated, but the alternative was leaving it somewhere, and she wasn't leaving it anywhere. Not now. She was 20 feet from the council chamber entrance when she heard him. Seraphine, Cedric's voice, behind her. She knew from the sound of it exactly how far, 12 feet, maybe 15, and he had not used a formal title and had not announced himself to the corridor the way he usually did when he intended the interaction to be observed. He had come quietly. He had been waiting. She stopped. She turned around. He was in the corridor alone. No retinue, no council officers, no household guard. He was dressed for the morning, coat half buttoned, the careful grooming slightly off, and he looked the way people look when they've been awake all night with something heavy. He looked at the umbrella under her arm, and something moved through his face, fast, controlled, but she read it before it was gone. He knew. Not everything, not the details, but he knew enough to be in this corridor at this hour waiting for her without witnesses. Put it down, he said. His voice was very quiet. She looked at him, 10 feet between them. The council chamber door behind her, 30 feet down the hall. Cedric, she said. Put the umbrella down, he said. Walk away from this corridor. Whatever you've built, whatever you think you have, I'm giving you the chance to put it down. She looked at his face. 44 years old, with the red that came into his eyes when he hadn't slept, and underneath the command a thing she hadn't seen in years, something close to something human. Whether it was fear or its neighbor, she couldn't entirely tell. He was a man who had participated in 4 years of fraud because he had wanted to and had believed he could, and who was standing in a corridor at dawn looking at his wife with the expression of a man who had just understood that wanting and believing were not the same as being right. You knew about the amendment, she said. His jaw tightened. You wrote the language, she said, before the council voted, before the review body was convened. She watched his face. There's a letter, Cedric, in Morel's hand, with your name in it. The corridor was very still. Put it down, he said again. Quieter this time. The command had changed shape. It wasn't an order anymore. It was something closer to a request, and they both knew the difference. I can't do that, she said. Seraphine, I couldn't do it 4 years ago, she said. I can't do it now, not because I want to hurt you. Because there are 3 coastal provinces that have been running short for 2 years, and people in them who don't know why, and a review body that exists specifically to steal from them. And your name is on the document that built it. Her voice was level, completely level. That's not something I can put down. He looked at her for a long time, the red in his eyes, the off-center coat buttons, the careful stillness of a man containing something that had no good direction to go. I will stop you, he said. You have 2 people between here and that chamber door, she said. I know they're there. I know where they're standing. She paused. You have maybe 4 minutes before Rain opens the session. 4 minutes to decide whether you walk into that room beside me or whether you try to stop me in this corridor and make it worse than it already is. His hands moved. She watched them. The specific movement of a man who has been reaching for a solution and has found that the available solutions are all bad. He could stop her physically, here, in the hall, but that would make noise, and noise would bring people. And the moment it became a public scene in the corridor, the two people he had stationed near the chamber door would be the least of his problems. He could try to reach Rain before the session opened, but Rain was already inside. He could try to have the documents seized, but he didn't know exactly what she had, and attempting a seizure without knowing what he was seizing was a risk he'd already identified as too open-ended. She had given him nothing to grab onto. She had moved fast enough that every option he had was worse than the one before it. He looked at the umbrella. He looked at her face. You could have come to me, he said, 2 years ago. A year ago. You could have told me what you'd found. Would it have changed anything? She said. He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She turned from him and walked the 30 feet to the council chamber door and put her hand on it, and behind her she heard him move. Not toward the door, not toward her, but sideways, into the corridor alcove, which meant he was thinking, which meant he hadn't decided what his move was, which meant she had the room for the next few minutes, but not longer. She pushed the door open. The council was assembled, 12 members in their seats, Rayan at the standing position that indicated a called session, Foss at his place with his hands folded on the table and his face deliberately neutral, Cress near the lower end of the table, his back straight, his eyes finding her immediately when she entered. The royal clerk at his station, 2 council scribes, the chamber's high windows showing the pale gray of the early morning outside, the Capitol below beginning its day unaware of what was being assembled in this room. Every head turned when she entered. She walked to the center of the room, not to the Queen's formal station, not to a peripheral position, but to the center, the open floor between the table and the high bench, where a person stood when they were presenting something to the full assembly. She set the umbrella on the table. Rain said, "The session is called under the military oversight provision, the full council present. The matter before this body." He stopped and looked at her, giving her the floor. She looked at the assembled faces, the council members who didn't yet know what this was, reading her face and reading Rain's and doing the fast arithmetic of political survival that smart people did when they walked into a room and understood that something significant was already in motion. The two who were Conrath adjacent, both visibly calculating. The appointment men, watching. She put her hand on the carved ivory handle of the umbrella. "This body has a problem," she said. Her voice was clear and level and carried to every corner of the chamber. "It's a problem that's been running for 4 years, and I have the documentation to prove every piece of it, and I'm going to lay it in front of you now." She opened the compartment in the handle, and behind her, as she began to remove the first of the documents, the council chamber door opened again, and every person in the room heard it, and she did not turn around because she had decided, precisely and finally, and without room for revision, that she was not going to turn around. Whatever was coming through that door was coming. She would not turn around to meet it before she was finished, because the documents in her hand were what mattered, and the room in front of her was what mattered, and she had not spent 4 years in the rain to turn around 30 seconds from the only moment that counted. She placed the first document on the table. Aldrich Foss reached forward and picked it up, and the room went very still. And behind her the footsteps from the open door crossed the chamber floor and stopped, and she laid down the second document, and then the third, and when she finally reached the last one, Morel's letter, 2 pages in a compressed, careful hand, with the king's name in the final paragraph, she turned around. Cedric was standing 10 feet away. He had come into the room. He was looking at the letter in her hand with the face of a man watching the ground give way beneath him, and she looked back at him across the 10 feet of council chamber floor. And in that silence, before a single word was spoken, every person in that room understood what they were witnessing. Foss said quietly and without hesitation, into the silence, "I'll confirm the documentation, every piece of it." And the room stopped breathing. The room held its breath for a long time, not metaphorically. There was an actual physical stillness in the council chamber. 12 men and women who had spent their careers learning to manage their faces in difficult moments and in this moment, not one of them was managing anything. They were just still, looking at the letter in Seraphine's hand and at Aldrich Foss's hands flat on the table beside the documents he'd confirmed, and at the king standing 10 feet from his wife, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has just understood that the structure he built his life inside has collapsed, and that he is now standing in the open air where it used to be. Cedric's face had gone through several things in quick succession and had landed on something that wasn't anger, wasn't denial, wasn't the commanding register he defaulted to when challenged. It was something older and rawer than any of those. The face of a man who had told himself a version of events for 4 years and was now, in this room, in front of these people, being asked to stop telling it. The letter was in Seraphine's hand. Foss had confirmed it. The room knew. There was nowhere left to stand that wasn't the truth. Seraphine set the letter down on the table beside the other documents. She did it carefully, the way she did everything, not performing the carefulness but actually being careful, because these were the materials that had to survive the next hour, intact and legible and real. She smoothed the edge of it with 2 fingers and stepped back. Lord Harwick Rain said, into the silence, "The Council will review the presented documentation before any declaration is entered into record. That is procedural standard." His voice was the voice he used when he was enforcing the shape of a situation against the pressure of people who wanted the shape to be different. All members will remain seated. That last sentence was directed at no one specifically. It was directed at the room's instinct to fracture, to splinter into factions and private calculations, and it worked the way Rain's voice usually worked, which was completely. One of the Conrath-adjacent council members, Lord Vers, a thin man from the eastern counties who had built his position over 15 years on the kind of careful proximity to power that required never being the first to move, said, "The documentation should be authenticated before this body draws any—" "It will be authenticated," Seraphine said. She didn't look at Vers when she said it. She was looking at the council as a whole, reading it the way she'd read rooms her entire adult life. The Eastern Customs records were provided by Governor Foss and sourced through his direct appointee in the verification post. The archive materials were accessed by the senior council archivist, who was available to speak to their provenance. The correspondence was obtained through a primary source with direct knowledge of the Conrath household's private communications. A pause. Every piece has a chain. If the council requires time to follow each chain individually, I will provide the time. But the documents exist and they say what they say, and the authentication will not change that. Vers said nothing else. He looked at his hands on the table. Rain said, "Governor Foss, you have confirmed the customs documentation." "I have," Foss said. "Lord Cress, you have direct knowledge of the archive access and its contents." Cress said, "Yes." Just that. The one word, clean and unembellished, the way she'd asked him to do it. She had told him not to perform certainty, just to have it, and he did. She noted it. Rain looked at the room. "The council will recess for 1 hour to review the documentation. At the end of that hour, this body will reconvene and enter a formal assessment." He looked finally at Cedric. "His Majesty is requested to remain in the palace during the recess period." Requested. The word was the most careful word in the sentence, and every person in the chamber heard the weight inside it. A king was not commanded. A king was requested. But the request, spoken by a senior military advisor in front of a full council in the context of documented fraud bearing the king's name, carried an entirely different kind of force than a request made under ordinary circumstances. Cedric looked at Rain. He looked at the documents on the table. He looked, finally, at Seraphine. She looked back. She did not offer him anything. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not the performance of victory that would have felt, in this moment, like the wrong thing and also like a small thing, a thing she had spent years trying not to become. She offered him the truth of what the room was, which was that it was over, and that the over had nothing to do with her feelings about it, and everything to do with what the document said. He turned and walked to the chamber door. 2 council clerks moved to accompany him, not restraining him, not escorting him in the custodial sense, just moving with him the way the institution moved with its people when the institution needed to know where they were. The door closed. Seraphine stood in the council chamber with the documents on the table and felt the hour of recess open in front of her like a space she hadn't known she needed. But she went to the East Garden, not to meet anyone, not to be seen, not for any purpose that had to do with the next stage of the proceedings. She went because she had been moving without stopping for 17 hours, and her body needed to be outside in the cold air for a few minutes before it decided that for her. The garden was empty at this hour, the groundskeepers not yet arrived, the paths still damp from the night. She walked 2 circuits of the outer path with her hands at her sides, and her breath visible in the cold and the pale morning light coming over the east wall, and touching the tops of the dormant shrubs and the stone benches and the gravel paths in the particular flat way that early light has before the sky has fully committed to the day. She thought about very little. Her mind had been running hard for 17 hours, and it needed a few minutes of simply looking at the garden without asking anything of the garden. And she gave it that. The gravel under her boots, the sound of birds in the old oak at the garden's edge, which had lost most of its leaves now but still held a few, dark and dry, that rattled when the wind found them. She thought about her mother. Not in a structured way, just a fragment, the specific memory of her mother's hands, which had been long and capable, and which Seraphine had inherited along with the iron combs, and which had taught her the same thing that the iron combs represented, which was that you could carry things through time if you were careful about what you chose to carry. Her mother had died when Seraphine was 22, 4 years into the marriage, and had not been present for any of the years since, but had left behind a quality of attention, a way of looking at situations steadily without flinching and without indulgence, that Seraphine had used the way other people use tools, worn it into the shape of her hands through 20 years of daily use. She thought about what it had cost, not what she'd given up in the public sense, the position, the alliance, the marriage that had never been a marriage in any real meaning of the word. Not the formal losses. She thought about the interior cost, the thing that didn't appear in documents and wasn't confirmed by witnesses. The years of waking up in the morning and deciding, again, not to let the situation be the largest thing in her. The discipline of sustained patience, which people who had never needed it tended to romanticize, and which was, in actual practice, grinding and unglamorous and sometimes actively painful, the way a long walk in bad weather was painful. Not a sharp pain, but a dull, sustained one that accumulated and had to be carried, and that didn't stop just because you were tired of carrying it. She had been tired for a long time. She hadn't known how tired until this morning, when she'd walked into the council chamber and set the last piece of the structure in place and felt it take the load. Something in her chest had shifted, not released, not the dramatic unspooling that people described in stories about justice, but something smaller and more honest. A settling. The way a person's shoulders drop when they've been holding a weight for a long time and finally set it down. And the dropping is so gradual they almost don't notice it. She noticed it now, in the East Garden, in the cold morning air, on the second circuit of the outer path. She stopped walking. She stood with her face in the direction of the east wall where the light was coming over, and let herself be still for a moment that wasn't preparing for anything. The council reconvened at the appointed hour. The formal assessment took the better part of 3 hours. Seraphine sat at the table as a formal witness and answered questions when questions were put to her, and gave nothing beyond what was asked, and added nothing that wasn't necessary because the documents were sufficient and the witnesses were credible, and the council was doing what councils did when the evidence was clear enough. They were building the case in the direction the evidence pointed, one careful step at a time, because a body like this moved by procedure and procedure was the thing that made its conclusions durable. Vers asked twice about the letter's provenance. Both times she answered the same way. Source confirmed, chain established, available for independent verification. Both times Vers accepted the answer without following it. He was a man measuring the direction of the wind and trying to determine which way to lean. By the second hour, the wind's direction was not in question. Esther was brought into the chamber at the midpoint of the assessment. She came in quietly and sat in the witness position and produced her own materials. The original draft of the tariff amendment, the notation in the margin in Cedric's identifiable hand, the confirmation request that predated the council vote. She answered every question in the same even, slightly compressed voice she used for everything. The voice of a woman who had spent 18 years in an archive and understood that precision was the only form of credibility that held up under pressure. When Esther finished, the chamber was very quiet again. A different quality of quiet than before. Before, the quiet had been the council processing shock. Now it was the council processing completion. The difference between the quiet at the beginning of understanding and the quiet at the end of it. Reen called for the formal assessment entry at the conclusion of the third hour. The vote was 11-1. Vers voted against, which surprised no one and changed nothing. The assessment entered into record was as follows. That documentation confirmed systematic revenue fraud in the eastern coastal provinces spanning 4 years. That the fraud was conducted through a falsely convened secondary review body whose composition was designed to facilitate unauthorized tariff reduction. That the revenue differential was estimated at a figure that constituted a significant crime against the Crown subjects. That the fraud had been authorized at the highest level of the royal administration, and that the Council, in accordance with the charter provisions governing executive malfeasance, was empowered to and did hereby suspend the executive authority of the Crown pending a full judicial inquiry. Suspended, not removed. The Council was careful about the language, because careful language was what made outcomes survive the next round of people who would contest them. But suspended was enough. Suspended meant that the things Cedric had tried to do in 3 days, the ceremony, the declaration, the public transfer of succession, was not going to happen. Not now. Not in this council's tenure. And the judicial inquiry that followed a suspension of this kind had a historically poor record of restoring what it had suspended. Cedric was in his chambers with 2 council officers at the door when the assessment was delivered to him. She was not present for that delivery. She had made the decision hours earlier that she did not need to be in the room when he received it, that her presence there would serve nothing except a version of herself she didn't want to be, and she had held to that decision. She learned the content of his response through Rain, who came to find her in the East Wing in the late afternoon. He accepted it, Rain said. He meant the suspension. Not gracefully, but he accepted it. And Morel, she said, the council officers went to her rooms this afternoon. She and her attendants are being held in the East residential quarters pending the inquiry. Rand paused. She asked to send a message. The officers declined. Seraphine nodded. The Conrath family. The governor is moving on the eastern properties tonight. The assets are significant. It will take time. He looked at her. The 2 council members named in the correspondence, Pell and Harton, have been suspended from the body pending inquiry. They didn't contest it. She thought about that, the specific quality of people who had been caught cleanly enough that contestation wasn't available to them, and who had the self-preservation instinct to recognize it. They'll cooperate with the inquiry, she said. Almost certainly. She looked out the window. The Capitol below, the late afternoon light, the particular golden quality that came in autumn from the low angle of the sun and turned everything it touched the color of something ending and something beginning at the same time. Harwick, she said. He waited. Thank you, she said, for the battlement wall, for tonight, for this morning. She looked at him. I know what it cost you to call that session. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been in this palace for 30 years. I've served 4 kings. A pause. It costs less to do the right thing than people think it does. It costs more to not do it. He said this in the flat, precise way he said most things, and she believed it because it was clear he had arrived at it through experience rather than philosophy. What happens now? He said. The inquiry runs its course, she said. The council manages executive functions in the interim. The charter has provisions for this. It's been used before, not in this generation, but before. She paused. I'll sit on the interim advisory council if the body requests it. I won't lead it. That's not what this was for. He looked at her. Some people will expect you to move into the formal position. Some people, she said, can adjust their expectations. Something shifted in his face that was almost, not quite, a smile. Esther's credentials have been reinstated, he said. I did that this morning, before the session. She hadn't known that. She looked at him. Seemed right, he said, and left. Basset. She went to see Esther that evening. The archivist was in her office in the lower archive, which was where she usually was at this hour, surrounded by the particular organized density of a workspace that belonged to a person who had spent a lifetime in one profession and had stopped being able to separate the work from the self. She looked up when Seraphine came in and put down what she was reading. "They've restored your access," Seraphine said. "I know," Esther said. "Rain's order. This morning. I'm told you held well in the council chamber." Esther looked at her steadily. "I told the truth in the right order," she said. "That's all it was." Seraphine sat in the chair across the work table. They were quiet for a moment, the comfortable silence of people who don't need to fill space with words because they have already communicated the significant things, and what remains is just the acknowledgement of having been in something together. "Your daughters," Seraphine said. "Both well," Esther said, neither aware of what today was. A pause. "I'd like to keep it that way, if possible." "I think that's possible," Seraphine said. Esther looked at the materials on her table. "There are going to be gaps in the record," she said, "from the amendment period, things that were altered or removed." She looked up. "It's going to take a long time to reconstruct what the archive should look like." "I know," Seraphine said. "I'd like to do it," Esther said simply, "if the council doesn't reassign the work. I'll make sure it isn't reassigned." Esther nodded once, the nod of a woman accepting something practical, which was the only way she accepted things. "Good," she said, and picked up what she'd been reading. Seraphine sat there for another few minutes in the warm quiet of the archive before she left. 3 weeks later, the Conrath assets were formally seized and their eastern provincial holdings placed under temporary receivership. The revenue figure confirmed by the inquiry, the amount that had been diverted over 4 years, was entered into the public record and provoked the response that correct numbers usually provoked in people who lived in the provinces that had been shorted. Not surprise, exactly, but the specific grim recognition of people who had known something was wrong and were now being told in formal language what it was. The coastal governors published a joint statement in the 5th week. 7 provinces. They called for the revenue to be returned directly to the communities that had lost it, distributed through the existing municipal structures rather than re-entered into the central treasury, which was a practical suggestion that also happened to be the kind of thing that built the specific kind of loyalty that was not decorative but structural. Seraphine read the statement and agreed with all of it, and said so in writing to the interim council. The interim council was managing well. Not perfectly. No body of 12 people managing executive functions in circumstances of significant institutional disruption managed perfectly. And the first month had contained several procedural tangles and one genuine crisis over the northern grain allocation that required 3 days of intensive work to resolve. But well enough. The charter provisions were holding. The work was being done. She was not leading it. She was advising it, when asked, on specific matters where her knowledge of the institutional landscape was useful, and she was watching the people in the body figure out how to carry the weight, which was different from carrying it for them, and which was, in the long run, more important. Theron Cress had surprised her. In the weeks following the council session, she'd watched him move from the uncertainty of that morning, the pale face, the unsteady hands, the youth showing through, into something that was quieter and more grounded. He'd made several decisions in the interim council proceedings that were better than what she would have expected from him, not because they were sophisticated, but because they were honest, and honesty at the right moment was worth more than sophistication. She had told him so directly, in the East Library, in a brief conversation that had lasted perhaps 10 minutes. He had looked at her the way young men look when something they were hoping was true turns out to be confirmed, and she had recognized the look and felt the weight of it, the responsibility of being the person whose assessment mattered to someone who was still figuring out what they were, and she had held it as carefully as she held everything. "Don't look to me to tell you what you are," she said before she left. "You were in that chamber. You did what you said you'd do. You know what that means." He had been quiet for a moment, then he'd said, "Is it always this hard?" She had thought about it honestly. "The first time," she said, "it's hard because you don't know if you can do it. After that, it's hard for different reasons." She had left him with that. In the second month, she had the cipher room cleared. It had served its purpose. The false shelf, the compartment in the umbrella's carved handle, the whole architecture of concealment she'd built into a room that looked like a storage space for outdated reference materials. It had all been necessary, and it was all now unnecessary, and unnecessary things had a way of becoming habits if you didn't take them apart deliberately. She had the false shelf removed and the wall behind it replastered. She had the reference materials that were actually useful moved to the East Library. She had the umbrella brought to the council chamber, where it was entered into the formal record as an exhibit of the inquiry proceedings. She thought, briefly, about what it felt like to hand it over. The ivory handle that she'd held in the rain in front of 3,000 people while Cedric's laughter moved through the wet air. The carved compartment that had held 4 years of evidence through a palace search and a corridor confrontation and a morning that had required everything she'd built and more. What she felt when she handed it over was not particularly dramatic. It was the quiet thing again, the settling. The correct placement of something in the category it now belonged to. The umbrella was evidence. It should be where evidence lived. She let it go. The judicial inquiry concluded in the 4th month. Cedric was formally stripped of executive authority by the inquiry tribunal, which was a different and more permanent thing than the council's suspension. He was not imprisoned. The charter provisions didn't require it, and Seraphine had made no argument for it, because what mattered was the cessation of the damage and not the punishment of the person who'd done it. And she had learned to keep those two things separate because conflating them was how outcomes became about retribution instead of repair. He was removed to the northern estate that was technically still his property. He would live out his life there in a condition that was not poverty and not freedom and not whatever he'd imagined for himself. She did not visit him before he left. She had thought about whether to, had spent several mornings with the question, not because she felt she owed him a farewell, but because she'd wanted to know her own reasons for not going to make sure they were the right ones. What she'd found, when she looked at it honestly, was that there was nothing to say that the record hadn't already said more accurately and more completely than she could in conversation, and that going to say it in person would be for her own sense of completion rather than for any legitimate purpose. She didn't need his acknowledgement. She didn't need to see his face in defeat. The work was done. The inquiry was complete. He was leaving. That was enough. It had to be enough, and she found, when she sat with it in the East Garden on the morning he departed, that it actually was. She walked more in those months than she had in years, not the purposeful circuit she'd maintained for 15 years, though she kept that too, in the mornings, her boots wearing a new groove in the East Garden path. She walked the city, the lower markets, the grain district, the coastal road that ran south from the capital toward the provinces that had been shorted. She walked with a small retinue, which the council had insisted on and which she had accepted as a reasonable security measure. And she talked to people, not in the formal way that heads of state talk to people, not the arranged conversations in controlled settings with the correct people selected in advance. She talked to the market vendors and the municipal assessors and the managers of the grain distribution points and the women who ran the civic water systems in the lower city. She asked the kind of questions that produced actual information rather than the kind that produced the information the person being asked thought you wanted to hear. She was not doing this to build power. She had people telling her, in various careful ways, that she was building power regardless, that her presence in the interim period and her visibility in the city was accumulating something that would eventually require a formal name. She heard this and did not argue with it and did not pursue it. What she was doing in the lower city was learning what the damage actually looked like from the inside of the communities that had lived in it, learning what repair would actually require, learning whether the people responsible for implementing it understood what was needed or were working from assumptions that hadn't been tested against the reality on the ground. Sometimes they understood. Sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, she said so directly and explained what she'd seen, and she did this without apology and without softening it into something that went down easier than the truth, because she had spent 20 years watching what happened when things were softened past their actual shape, and she had no interest in repeating that particular experience in either direction. Yet, Mira came to find her one evening in the 5th month. She was in the outer sitting room, the one with the window that overlooked the courtyard, The same room where she'd been standing when Mira came to tell her about the altered procession arrangement on the evening of the Harvest Festival, 5 months ago. It felt, when she thought about it, like a different life that had happened to the same person, which was perhaps the accurate way to describe it. Mira sat in the chair across from her, which she rarely did. Usually she stood, maintained the precise physical vocabulary of her position. But this evening she sat, which meant this was a different kind of conversation. "You should sleep more," Mira said. Seraphine looked at her. "I sleep." "Not enough. Not since the inquiry concluded." A pause. "You've done what you set out to do. The body's allowed to know that." She thought about this. "I know it," she said. "Knowing and letting it change how you carry yourself," Mira said, "are different things." They sat in the quiet of the room. Below, the courtyard was dark. The old oak a bare silhouette against the sky, its branches still, the storm weather long past. The same courtyard where the procession had assembled. The same stone, the same walls, the same windows looking out on it. "I was angry," Seraphine said. Not at anyone, not directed. Just a fact she was stating for the first time out loud to another person. "For a long time. Under all of it. I was angry." Mira said nothing. Waited. "And I used it," she said. "I turned it into something useful. That was the right thing to do with it. But it was still anger. It was still something that cost me something to carry that long." She paused. "I'm not sure what to do with the space it leaves." Mira looked at her with the careful eyes of a woman who had spent 11 years close enough to know what wasn't said as clearly as what was. "You've been running on it for 4 years," she said. "You're allowed to stop running." "I don't know what that looks like," Seraphine said. "I know," Mira said. "That's all right. Most people don't the first time." They stayed there for a while longer in the room with the window and the bare oak outside, and the city going quiet around them. And it was one of those evenings that didn't ask anything of anyone, which was its own kind of gift, rarer than it should have been and more valuable than it looked. Bad. The following spring, the coastal provinces reported their first clean revenue quarter in 4 years. The figure was entered into the public record without ceremony. Seraphine read it in the morning briefing and set the briefing down and went on with her day. That afternoon, a delegation from the 3 shorted provinces came to the capital to present a formal acknowledgement of the inquiry's findings to the interim council. They brought, among other things, a small delegation of municipal representatives who had been directly involved in managing the distribution of the recovered funds. The people who had been inside the problem when it was a problem and who were now inside the solution, which meant they understood both ends of it in a way that no amount of external review could fully replicate. Seraphine met with them for 2 hours. She asked them what had worked. She asked them what hadn't. She asked them what they wished the capital administration understood about what their communities actually needed, that it currently seemed not to. She took notes in her own hand, not for the record, not for the council briefing, but for herself, because the information was real and she intended to use it. And the act of writing something down in your own hand was the act of committing your own attention to it, rather than delegating the attention along with the task. One of the delegates, a woman from the coastal district, perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had spent her life in salt air, said, at the end of the 2 hours, "We heard what happened, what you did, how long it took." Seraphine looked at her. "People in the district," the woman said, "they say it different ways, but what they mostly say is that you didn't give up." She paused. "That counts for something out there. That counts for more than people think." Seraphine held the woman's gaze. "What counts for more," she said after a moment, "is the clean revenue quarter." The woman smiled. Not a polished smile, a real one, with wear in it. "Yes," she said, "that too." Maut. The oak in the east courtyard put out new leaves in April. She noticed them on her morning walk, the first small green against the gray of the bark, tentative and exact, the tree doing what trees did after winter without being asked and without ceremony. She stopped on the path and looked at them for a moment. Then she walked on. There was work to do. There always was, and she had never been the kind of person who needed the absence of work to feel that something had been resolved. Resolution was not the end of effort. It was a change in what the effort was for, a shift from the long-sustained push of necessity into something that was still demanding, still unglamorous, still requiring the same quality of attention and patience that had gotten her through 20 years of a situation designed to unmake her. But different. The thing she'd spent 4 years building in the dark had been about ending something. What came after was about building something, which was a different kind of work, and she found, walking the East Garden in the April morning with the oak putting out leaves and the groundskeepers arriving at the far end of the path with their tools, that she was ready for it. Not eager in the way of someone starting something new, ready in the way of someone who knows what they're capable of and has run out of reasons to spend that capability on anything less than what it's for. She picked up her pace on the Third Circuit, her boots on the gravel, the cold morning air, the sound of the city beginning on the other side of the palace walls. She had work to do. She went to do it.